Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey into the darkness. Tonight, we're stepping through the iron gates of Arkham Asylum to uncover the twisted origins of every soul trapped within its walls. These aren't just stories of madness, these are chronicles of tragedy, betrayal, and the thin line that separates sanity from chaos in Gotham City. Before we descend into these haunted corridors together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's exploration into Gotham's darkest secrets. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into the psychology of villainy, and drop a comment letting me know what part of the world you're listening from tonight. I love seeing our global community come together to explore these incredible stories. Now get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite listening spot, and prepare yourself for a night unlike any other. Because what we're about to uncover will change how you see every villain Batman has ever faced. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. in Gotham City. Rain hammers against the Gothic windows of Arkham Asylum as Dr. Sarah Chen, the night shift psychiatrist, walks through the maximum security wing. Her footsteps echo off cold stone walls that have witnessed decades of madness. She carries with her a leather briefcase containing patient files that the public has never seen. Files that reveal the true origins of Gotham's most notorious criminals. But as she rounds the corner toward the Joker's cell, she stops. The hallway that should be filled with the usual sounds of restless inmates is completely silent. Too silent. Her hand trembles as she reaches for her security radio, and that's when she hears it, a soft, haunting laughter echoing from the darkness ahead. Not the Joker's maniacal cackle, but something far more disturbing, something that sounds almost like crying. She approaches the first cell and peers through the reinforced glass. Inside, a figure sits motionless in the corner, but something is wrong. The patient file in her hands doesn't match what she's seeing. According to the records, this cell should be empty tonight. But there he is, a man in a purple suit, his face hidden in shadow, whispering something over and over again. Dr. Chen leans closer to the glass, straining to hear the words, and that's when she realizes what he's saying. He's reciting names: Harvey Dent, Pamela Isley, Edward Nygma, Victor Fries. One by one, he's listing every villain who has ever walked these halls, and with each name, the temperature in the corridor seems to drop another degree. She opens the first patient file with shaking hands, and what she reads there will haunt her for the rest of her life. Because the truth about Gotham's villains isn't what the world believes. These aren't simply evil people who chose darkness. These are broken souls who were failed by every system meant to protect them. Each file tells a story of a moment when everything changed, when hope died, and when ordinary people became the monsters that now terrorize Gotham's nights. The Joker's file reveals not one origin story, but dozens, each more tragic than the last. Harley Quinn's psychiatric evaluations show a brilliant mind slowly corrupted by love and obsession. Two-Face's medical records document not just physical scarring, but the psychological fracture that split one man into two warring personalities. But here's what Dr. Chen discovers that night, and what we're about to explore together. Every villain's story is connected. Every tragedy builds upon the last, and at the center of it all is a pattern so disturbing that it will make you question everything you thought you knew about good and evil in Gotham City. As she continues, reading through the night, Dr. Chen realizes that Arkham Asylum isn't just a hospital for the criminally insane. It's a monument to a city's failure to save its own children, because every villain in these files was once someone's son or daughter, someone's student or colleague, someone who needed help but received only pain. Tonight we're going to walk Through those same corridors, we're going to open those same files, and we're going to discover that the real horror isn't the crimes these villains committed, but the tragedies that created them in the first place. So take a deep breath, and let's begin our journey into the heart of darkness itself. Because by the time the sun rises, you'll understand that in Gotham City, the line between hero and villain is far thinner than anyone dares to admit. Our story begins in the shadow of Gotham's most infamous landmark. Arkham Asylum stands like a Gothic cathedral of madness on the northern shore of the city, its spires cutting through the perpetual fog that seems to cling to its walls. Built in 1974 by the Arkham family, this fortress was meant to be a beacon of hope for the mentally ill. Instead, it became their tomb. The asylum's architecture tells its own story of descent into darkness. Medieval towers twist toward storm clouds that never seem to leave this part of Gotham. Gargoyles perch on every corner, their stone eyes watching both the city below and the horrors contained within. The building's limestone walls have absorbed decades of screams, pleas, and the hollow laughter of minds that have snapped under pressure no human should endure. Tonight, our guide through this labyrinth of madness is Dr. Jeremiah Arkham, descendant of the asylum's founder and current chief psychiatrist. Dr. Arkham carries the weight of his family's legacy in every measured step through the institution's halls. His great-grandfather, Amadeus Arkham, built this place after watching his own mother succumb to mental illness, believing he could create a sanctuary for healing. Instead, the Arkham name became synonymous with everything terrifying about the human mind's capacity for destruction. Dr. Arkham's office sits in the asylum's highest tower, surrounded by patient files that stretch back generations. The walls are lined with leather-bound journals, psychiatric evaluations, and treatment records that document the evolution of Gotham's criminal underworld. Each file represents not just a case study, but a human being whose story ended in these sterile corridors. As rain pelts the Gothic windows, Dr. Arkham opens his desk drawer and retrieves a worn brass key. This key unlocks the restricted archives, patient files so disturbing that they're kept separate from the standard records. These are the files of Gotham's supervillains, individuals whose crimes transcended ordinary criminal behavior and entered the realm of legend. The maximum security wing exists in the asylum's deepest levels, carved directly into the bedrock beneath Gotham. The air here carries a weight that presses against your chest, thick with the presence of minds that have touched depths of madness most people cannot imagine. Each cell is a masterpiece of psychological containment, designed not just to hold bodies, but to contain the infectious nature of true insanity. Cell Block A houses the asylum's most notorious residents. The Joker's cell sits at the corridor's end, its reinforced glass scarred by countless attempts at escape. The walls inside are covered with his twisted artwork, painted in substances the maintenance staff refuses to identify. Even when sedated, his presence seems to contaminate the air around his cell, making guards nervous and visitors physically ill. Across the hall, Harvey Dent's cell is divided perfectly down the middle. One half maintains the pristine organization of a former district attorney, with legal books stacked precisely and papers filed with meticulous care. The other half exists in chaos, covered in scratched tallies marking every decision left to chance, every life destroyed by the flip of a coin. Dr. Arkham pauses at each cell, his fingers tracing the nameplates that mark decades of failure. Victor. Fry's, whose cell maintains a constant temperature of -40 degrees, sits frozen in more ways than one. Pamela Isley's containment unit resembles a greenhouse more than a prison, filled with plants that seem to respond to her emotional state, their leaves rustling without any wind. The isolation chambers hold the asylum's most dangerous residents. Jonathan Crane's cell contains no windows, no sources of light beyond what's necessary for basic survival. Even the most hardened guards refuse overnight shifts in this section, claiming they can hear whispers coming from behind the soundproof walls, whispers that plant seeds of fear in their dreams. Edward Nygma's cell represents a puzzle in itself. Every surface is covered with riddles, mathematical equations, and logic problems that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. Guards report that solving even one of his puzzles leads to sleepless nights filled with increasingly complex mental challenges that feel like psychological traps. But it's not just the infamous villains who inhabit these halls. The asylum houses dozens of lesser-known criminals whose stories are equally tragic. Calendar Man marks time with patterns only he can see. The ventriloquist carries on conversations with a wooden dummy that seems to possess its own malevolent intelligence. Zash counts his victims by carving tally marks into his own flesh, each scar representing a life he believes he freed from meaningless existence. Dr. Arkham understands that his role extends beyond simple containment. He serves as chronicler, confessor, and witness to the darkest chapters of human experience. Every therapy session reveals new layers of trauma, new connections between seemingly random acts of violence, and new evidence that Gotham itself might be the ultimate source of the madness he's sworn to treat. The staff that works within these walls carries their own scars. Nurses develop nervous tics after extended exposure to certain patients. Security guards request transfers to Blackgate Penitentiary, claiming that dealing with ordinary criminals is preferable to the psychological warfare waged by Arkham's residents. Psychiatrists leave the profession entirely, their faith in human redemption shattered by what they've witnessed in these depths. As night deepens around the asylum, Dr. Arkham prepares to share the stories contained within these files. Stories that reveal how ordinary people become extraordinary monsters. Stories that trace the precise moments when hope dies and evil is born. Stories that prove the most terrifying truth of all, that given the right circumstances, any of us could end up on the wrong side of these reinforced doors. The Gothic towers of Arkham Asylum stand sentinel over Gotham tonight, holding secrets that the world isn't ready to hear. But we're ready. We're ready to open those files and discover what creates a villain in a city where heroes wear masks and justice hides in shadow. Dr. Arkham's hands hover over the first file, its manila cover worn smooth by decades of handling. The name, printed in faded ink, reads simply Patient 001. But everyone who works in these halls knows this designation belongs to the Clown Prince of Crime himself. The Joker's file is thicker than most medical textbooks, filled with contradictory reports, impossible timelines, and enough different origin stories to fill a library of human tragedy. Opening the file reveals the fundamental mystery that has plagued Gotham's law enforcement for decades. Who was the Joker before he became the embodiment of chaos? The most widely accepted theory traces back to the Ace chemical plant incident, where a small-time criminal known only as the Red Hood fell into a vat of industrial chemicals while fleeing Batman during his early career. The chemical bath bleached his skin chalk white, turned his hair green, and stretched his lips into a permanent rictus grin. But the physical transformation was nothing compared to what happened to his mind. See, Red Hood himself remains an enigma. Some reports suggest he was a failed comedian named Jack, desperate to provide for his pregnant wife. Others claim he was a petty thief who stole the Red Hood identity for a single heist. The Joker himself has given dozens of different versions of his past, each more elaborate and contradictory than the last. During one therapy session, he claimed to have been a chemical engineer. In another, a professional assassin. Sometimes he insists he was never anyone at all before that night at Ace Chemicals. What makes the Joker's case particularly disturbing is his apparent awareness of these contradictions. He once told Dr. Arkham that he prefers his past to be multiple choice, because madness is the emergency exit from an unbearable reality. The truth, he claims, would be far too boring for someone of his theatrical nature. This psychological defense mechanism, this deliberate fragmentation of identity, represents one of the most sophisticated forms of dissociation ever documented in psychiatric literature. But the Joker's story becomes even more complex when we examine his relationship with Dr. Harley Quinn, the brilliant psychiatrist who would become his most devoted accomplice. Dr. Quinzel graduated summa cum laude from Gotham University with a doctorate in psychology, specializing in criminal psychoanalysis. Her academic record was flawless. Her professors described her as compassionate, insightful, and destined for greatness in the field of mental health. Harley Quinzel's transformation into Harley Quinn represents one of the most dramatic falls from grace in psychiatric history. She volunteered to treat the Joker specifically because his case presented the ultimate professional challenge. Her initial sessions with him were textbook examples of proper therapeutic technique. She maintained appropriate boundaries, followed established protocols, and documented every interaction with meticulous detail. The first crack in her professional facade appeared during their 7th session. The Joker had been unusually quiet, almost melancholic, as he spoke about the loneliness of being completely misunderstood. He described the weight of being society's designated monster, the individual everyone could blame for the chaos that already existed in their heart. Dr. Quinzel found herself genuinely moved by his apparent vulnerability. What she didn't realize was that she was witnessing the Joker's greatest performance. He had spent weeks studying her psychological profile, learning about her own childhood traumas and insecurities. Her father had abandoned the family when she was 12. Her mother struggled with depression. Harleen herself had chosen psychology, partly to understand the abandonment that had shaped her early life. The Joker identified these wounds with surgical precision and began to exploit them with masterful manipulation. Their sessions gradually shifted from therapy to something resembling intimate conversation. The Joker began to position himself as the only person who truly understood her intelligence and ambition. He suggested that the psychiatric establishment was holding her back, that her brilliance was being wasted on conventional patients with mundane problems. He painted himself as a kindred spirit, someone equally misunderstood by a world too small for exceptional minds. The transformation accelerated when the Joker shared what he claimed was his real origin story. He told her about his wife, about the comedy career that never took off, about the desperation that drove him to crime. He wept as he described losing everything in a single night, and Dr. Quinzel found herself crying with him. This emotional breakthrough felt like the therapeutic victory she had always dreamed of achieving. Of course, the story was likely another fabrication, but its psychological impact on Dr. Quinzel was devastatingly real. She began to see the Joker not as a patient, but as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Her professional objectivity eroded as she convinced herself that she was witnessing genuine remorse and vulnerability beneath his chaotic exterior. The Joker's manipulation reached its climax during a manufactured crisis. He claimed that other inmates were planning to kill him, that corrupt guards were allowing it to happen, and that she was the only person who could save him. Dr. Quinzel's protective instincts, already compromised by months of psychological conditioning, overrode her professional judgment. She smuggled him civilian clothes during a session and helped him escape from Arkham. The moment she committed that first crime, Harley Quinzel ceased to exist. The Joker had successfully transformed a respected psychiatrist into his devoted accomplice through a combination of emotional manipulation, psychological exploitation, and carefully manufactured intimacy. Her blonde hair became platinum white, with red and blue highlights. Her conservative professional attire gave way to a jester's costume. Most tragically, her compassionate nature became twisted into blind devotion to a man who viewed her as nothing more than an amusing pet. Harley Quinn's criminal career began immediately after her escape from professional life. She helped the Joker execute increasingly elaborate schemes against Batman and Gotham's citizens. Her psychological training made her uniquely qualified to anticipate and counter the detective's investigative methods. Her knowledge of human behavior allowed her to manipulate victims and witnesses with disturbing effectiveness. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Harley Quinn's story is her persistent belief that the Joker genuinely loves her. Despite years of abuse, abandonment, and casual cruelty, she continues to view their relationship as a grand romance. The Joker discards her whenever she becomes inconvenient, yet she always returns, convinced that their next reunion will be different. Her psychological evaluation reveals the complete success of the Joker's conditioning. She exhibits classic symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, trauma bonding, and learned helplessness. Her original personality occasionally surfaces during moments of extreme stress, but these glimpses of Dr. Harleen Quinzel are quickly suppressed by the Harley Quinn persona that has become her dominant identity. The tragedy of Harley Quinn extends beyond her own destruction. Her transformation eliminated one of Gotham's most promising mental health professionals and created another dangerous criminal. The Joker didn't just corrupt an individual, he robbed the city of someone who might have helped heal the very wounds that create villains in the first place. Their relationship represents the Joker's most sophisticated triumph over Batman's moral philosophy. The Dark Knight believes that everyone can be redeemed, that even the worst criminals retain some spark of humanity worth saving. But the Joker's corruption of Dr. Quinzel demonstrates his ability to destroy goodness itself, to transform virtue into vice through pure psychological manipulation. As Dr. Arkham closes their files and reaches for the next set of documents, the weight of these transformations settles over the asylum like fog. The Joker and Harley Quinn represent more than just criminal cases. They embody the terrifying possibility that anyone's identity can be rewritten, that the foundations of personality are far more fragile than we dare to admit. The rain continues to strike the Gothic windows as we prepare to examine the next files, each containing another story of transformation, another moment when someone's life pivoted from light into darkness. Because in Gotham City, the distance between doctor and patient, between savior and destroyer, can be measured in a single decision. A moment of vulnerability, a whisper in the dark that changes everything forever. The next file bears the seal of the Gotham District Attorney's Office, its official letterhead now seeming like a relic from another world. Harvey Dent's transformation into Two-Face represents one of the most documented descents into madness in Arkham's archives, partly because his fall from grace was so public, so complete, and so tied to Batman's own early career as Gotham's protector. Harvey Dent was once Gotham's golden boy, the youngest district attorney in the city's history, and the closest thing to a white knight that the corrupt political system had ever produced. Born in the crime-ridden East End, Harvey witnessed his father's violent alcoholism and his mother's quiet desperation. Rather than being destroyed by this environment, young Harvey channeled his anger into an obsession with justice that would define his entire adult life. His academic achievements were remarkable, even by Gotham University's elevated standards. Harvey graduated at the top of his law class while simultaneously earning a degree in psychology, driven by a desire to understand the criminal mind he would spend his career fighting. His professors remembered him as intensely focused, almost fanatically dedicated to the concept of absolute justice in a world that seemed to operate on compromise and corruption. The irony of Harvey's psychology degree would only become apparent years later when his own fractured mind became a case study in dissociative identity disorder. His undergraduate thesis examined the concept of moral duality in criminal behavior, arguing that most people contain both good and evil impulses, with civilization serving as the thin barrier that prevents chaos from consuming order. He had no way of knowing he was writing his own psychological profile. Harvey's rise through Gotham's legal system was meteoric. As an assistant district attorney, he achieved conviction rates that seemed almost impossible in a city where evidence mysteriously disappeared and witnesses frequently developed amnesia. His secret was an obsessive attention to detail combined with an intuitive understanding of criminal psychology. He could anticipate how defense attorneys would attack his cases and prepare accordingly. His friendship with Bruce Wayne began during the early days of Batman's career, when Harvey was one of the few city officials willing to work with the mysterious vigilante. While Commissioner Gordon provided tactical support, Harvey offered legal cover, finding ways to make Batman's evidence admissible in court and ensuring that captured criminals stayed behind bars. This partnership between the official and unofficial guardians of justice created the most effective crime-fighting team Gotham had ever seen. The psychological pressure of this dual existence began to manifest in subtle ways that only became apparent after his transformation. Harvey started carrying a silver dollar, which he claimed was a lucky coin inherited from his father. He would flip it during moments of stress, though always with the same result, since both sides of the coin were identical. This ritual provided the illusion of chance while maintaining his sense of control over every decision. His relationship with Gilda Gold provided the only softness in a life otherwise consumed by the pursuit of justice. Gilda, a sculptor who worked with light and shadow themes, understood Harvey's dedication to his work while providing the emotional balance he desperately needed. Their engagement represented hope that Harvey might find happiness beyond the courtroom, that his obsession with justice could coexist with personal fulfillment. The acid attack that transformed Harvey Dent into Two-Face occurred during the trial of Sal Maroni, one of Gotham's most powerful crime bosses. Maroni had been untouchable for years, protected by corruption and intimidation, until Harvey built an airtight case against him. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were protected, and conviction seemed inevitable. Maroni's desperation led him to smuggle a vial of concentrated acid into the courtroom, hidden in his lawyer's briefcase. The attack happened during Harvey's closing argument. Maroni waited until Harvey turned toward the jury, then hurled the acid at the left side of his face and neck. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Harvey's screams filled the courtroom as the acid ate through skin and muscle, exposing bone and permanently damaging his left eye. Emergency medical teams rushed him to Gotham General, but the physical damage was only the beginning of his transformation. The psychological trauma of the attack shattered Harvey's carefully constructed identity. The man who had devoted his life to justice discovered that justice itself was meaningless in the face of random violence. His belief system, built on the foundation that good would ultimately triumph over evil, collapsed when he realized that evil could destroy good in a single moment of chaos. During his recovery, Harvey's personality began to fracture along the same line as his physical scarring. The undamaged right side of his face maintained his original appearance, while the left side became a grotesque reminder of that terrible moment in the courtroom. This physical duality triggered a psychological split that manifested as two distinct personalities sharing the same body. The Harvey Dent personality retained his knowledge of law and his basic moral compass, but became increasingly obsessed with the concept of duality. He began to see the world in terms of binary choices, absolute divisions between right and wrong, good and evil, order and chaos. The Two-Face personality emerged as the embodiment of chance and destruction, believing that all of life's decisions should be left to the flip of a coin. His lucky silver dollar became scarred on one side during the acid attack, transforming it into the perfect symbol of his fractured psyche. The clean side represented Harvey Dent's desire for justice and order, while the scarred side embodied Two-Face's embrace of chaos and chance. Every major decision was subjected to the coin flip, from choosing which criminals to target to determining whether captured victims would live or die. Two-Face's first crime spree targeted everyone connected to his transformation. Sal Maroni was found dead in his cell, though no one could determine how Two-Face had gained access to the maximum security prison. The corrupt judge who had allowed Maroni's lawyer to bring the briefcase into the courtroom disappeared entirely. His body never recovered. Even Harvey's own security detail became targets as Two-Face blamed them for failing to prevent the attack. But the most heartbreaking victim of Harvey's transformation was Gilda Gold. Two-Face became obsessed with the concept that she could only love half of him, that her affection for Harvey Dent meant she must logically hate the Two-Face persona. He began subjecting her to increasingly elaborate coin flip scenarios, forcing her to choose between contradictory demands that satisfied neither personality. The psychological evaluation that led to his commitment at Arkham revealed the complete integration of both personalities. Harvey Dent and Two-Face weren't alternating control of the same body. They were engaged in constant internal dialogue, arguing about every decision and action. This unique form of dissociative identity disorder created a criminal who was simultaneously one of Gotham's most intelligent legal minds and one of its most unpredictable threats. Edward Nygma's file presents a different but equally tragic pattern of transformation. Born to an abusive father who viewed intelligence as weakness, young Edward learned early that his brilliant mind was both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. His father's physical abuse was triggered by Edward's academic achievements, creating a psychological trap where success led to punishment and failure led to contempt. Edward's childhood was marked by an obsessive need to prove his intellectual superiority while simultaneously hiding it from his father's violent attention. He began creating elaborate puzzles and riddles as a form of mental exercise, developing the foundation for what would become his criminal signature. These early puzzles served multiple purposes, providing intellectual stimulation, creating a sense of control in a chaotic home environment, and establishing a private world where his intelligence could flourish without consequences. His transformation into the Riddler began with a seemingly innocent childhood incident that would define his entire psychological development. During a spelling bee competition, Edward discovered that one of the teachers was providing answers to her favored students. Rather than reporting this directly, Edward created an elaborate riddle that exposed the corruption while demonstrating his own superior intellect. The teacher was fired, the competition was cancelled, and Edward learned that riddles could be weapons more powerful than direct confrontation. The pattern emerges as Dr. Arkham continues through the files, each tragedy building upon the last. There seems to be a formula to Gotham's descent into chaos, a predictable sequence where good intentions collide with brutal reality, creating monsters from the wreckage of shattered dreams. But this apparent simplicity proves to be deceptive, masking deeper currents of corruption that run through the city's very foundations. Edward Nygma's evolution from gifted child to criminal mastermind appears straightforward at first glance. Abuse creates obsession, obsession creates compulsion, compulsion creates crime. The Riddler's need to prove his intellectual superiority through elaborate puzzles seems like a natural progression from his childhood trauma. But this surface explanation fails to account for the sophisticated nature of his criminal enterprises and the almost supernatural precision of his psychological manipulation. The truth about Edward's transformation lies buried in the records of his brief employment at Wayne Enterprises. Fresh out of Gotham University with degrees in engineering and computer science, Edward was hired as a software developer for the company's security division. His job involved creating encryption algorithms and digital puzzle systems to protect Wayne's vast network of business interests. For the first time in his life, Edward's obsession with riddles and puzzles was not only accepted, but celebrated and financially rewarded. His supervisor, Dr. Daniel Mockridge, initially praised Edward's innovative approach to cybersecurity. The encryption systems Edward designed were virtually unbreakable, using mathematical principles so advanced that even other experts in the field struggled to understand his methodology. Edward thrived in this environment, finally finding a place where his intellectual gifts were appreciated rather than punished. The corruption began when Dr. Mockridge started taking credit for Edward's work. Patent applications were filed under Mockridge's name. Conference presentations featured Mockridge explaining algorithms he barely understood. When Edward confronted him about this theft, Mockridge threatened to have him fired and blacklisted throughout Gotham's tech industry. The betrayal shattered Edward's faith in legitimate achievement, proving that even in the professional world, intelligence without power was meaningless. Edward's revenge was subtle but devastating. He embedded hidden messages throughout Wayne Enterprises' security systems, riddles that would gradually corrupt the company's data while providing clues to the identity of the real creator. But when these digital breadcrumbs were discovered, Edward found himself not celebrated as the brilliant programmer he was, but dismissed as a disgruntled employee seeking attention. The very riddles that should have proven his genius instead marked him as unstable and potentially dangerous. His termination from Wayne Enterprises represented more than job loss. It was the death of Edward's belief in fairness and justice. If even Bruce Wayne's company, supposedly one of Gotham's most ethical organizations, would steal from its employees and silence whistleblowers, then the entire system was corrupt beyond redemption. Edward's transformation into the Riddler began with this realization that conventional success was impossible for someone like him. But there was another factor in Edward's psychological collapse that wouldn't be discovered until years later. Dr. Mockridge wasn't acting alone in his theft of Edward's work. The encryption algorithms Edward had created were being sold to criminal organizations throughout Gotham, providing them with unbreakable communication systems that law enforcement couldn't penetrate. Edward's brilliant security measures were being used to facilitate the very crimes he thought he was helping to prevent. This revelation, when it finally emerged during therapy sessions at Arkham, completed Edward's psychological transformation. Not only had his work been stolen, but it had been perverted to serve evil purposes. The Riddler's obsession with leaving clues for Batman wasn't just about proving intellectual superiority. It was about ensuring that his current crimes could be solved, unlike the original theft of his work that had gone unpunished. The file on Stick, Pamela Isley, reveals similar layers of deception beneath the surface narrative of her transformation into Poison Ivy. The official story describes a promising graduate student in environmental science who was transformed by unethical experiments into an eco-terrorist with the ability to control plant life. But this version omits crucial details about the nature of those experiments and the identity of the scientist who conducted them. Dr. Jason Woodrue was already a controversial figure in Gotham's scientific community when Pamela became his research assistant. His theories about plant consciousness and the potential for human-plant hybridization were considered fringe science by most academics, but his research was secretly funded by several pharmaceutical companies interested in the potential applications of his work. Pamela, fresh from her undergraduate studies in botany, was drawn to his revolutionary approach to environmental science. The transformation began gradually, almost imperceptibly. Dr. Woodrue convinced Pamela that small doses of experimental plant toxins would enhance her natural immunity and allow her to work more closely with dangerous specimens. These injections were presented as necessary safety measures, similar to the vaccinations required for researchers working with infectious diseases. Pamela trusted her mentor completely, viewing him as a visionary who would help her save the world's dying ecosystems. What she didn't know was that Dr. Woodrue was using her as a test subject for a much larger project. The pharmaceutical companies funding his research weren't interested in environmental protection. They wanted to develop biological weapons that could be deployed against enemy agricultural systems. Pamela's gradual transformation into a human-plant hybrid was documented in classified reports that wouldn't surface until years after her first arrest as Poison Ivy. The psychological manipulation was as systematic as the physical transformation. Dr. Woodrue gradually isolated Pamela from her friends and family, convincing her that normal humans could never understand her evolving connection to plant life. He introduced her to increasingly radical environmental philosophies, arguing that humanity was a cancer on the earth that needed to be eliminated for nature to survive. These ideas took root in Pamela's altered brain chemistry, becoming obsessions that would define her criminal career. The night of her final transformation was carefully orchestrated by Dr. Woodrue to appear accidental. A laboratory explosion exposed Pamela to concentrated doses of every toxin and mutagen she had been gradually absorbing over months of experimentation. The chemical bath that created Poison Ivy wasn't a random accident. It was the culmination of a deliberate process designed to create the perfect eco-terrorist while providing Dr. Woodrue with plausible deniability. Pamela's emergence from that toxic baptism marked the death of her human identity and the birth of something far more dangerous. Her skin took on a greenish tint that made normal human contact impossible. Her breath became poisonous to anyone without plant-based immunity. Most tragically, her capacity for human emotion was replaced by an obsessive love for plant life and an equally intense hatred for the animal kingdom, including humanity itself. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of Pamela's transformation was that her environmental concerns were originally genuine and justified. Gotham's industrial pollution was indeed destroying the local ecosystem. The pharmaceutical companies she had hoped to work with were planning to exploit her research for profit rather than environmental protection. Her transformation into Poison Ivy represented the perversion of legitimate environmental activism into something monstrous and counterproductive. Victor Fries presents yet another variation on this theme of corrupted good intentions. The man who would become Mr. Freeze was, once one of Gotham's most respected cryogenic researchers, driven by love rather than hatred, hope rather than despair. His wife Nora suffered from a rare degenerative disease called McGregor's syndrome, and Victor dedicated his entire career to finding a cure that would save her life. The tragedy of Victor Fries lies not in the failure of his research, but in its success. He had actually developed a viable treatment for Nora's condition, a combination of cryogenic preservation and experimental gene therapy that could halt the disease's progression and potentially reverse its effects. His work represented a breakthrough that could have saved thousands of lives and established him as one of history's greatest medical researchers. The corruption of Victor's noble purpose came through the intervention of his employer, Gothcorp Industries, and its ruthless CEO, Ferris Boyle. Boyle saw the potential profits from Victor's research and decided to accelerate the timeline for human trials, despite Victor's protests that more testing was needed to ensure Nora's safety. When Victor refused to compromise his wife's well-being for corporate profits, Boyle had him forcibly removed from his own laboratory, while Nora remained in cryogenic suspension. The accident that transformed Victor Fries into Mr. Freeze happened during his desperate attempt to save Nora from Boyle's interference. When security guards tried to disconnect her cryogenic chamber, Victor fought back with the fury of a man watching his beloved die before his eyes. In the struggle, the laboratory's cooling systems were damaged, releasing a massive blast of supercooled gases that should have killed him instantly. Instead, the same experimental compounds he had been developing to treat Nora's condition interacted with his body chemistry in an unprecedented way. Victor's cellular structure was fundamentally altered by the cryogenic exposure. His metabolism slowed to nearly imperceptible levels, his body temperature dropped to sub-zero ranges, and his skin took on a bluish pallor that marked him as something no longer entirely human. But the most devastating change was psychological. The emotional warmth that had driven his love for Nora became literally impossible for him to experience. The accident had frozen not just his body, but his capacity for human connection. The cruel irony of Victor's transformation is that it made him immortal while condemning him to watch Nora remain forever out of reach. His new physiology granted him immunity to aging and disease, but it also made normal human contact impossible. He could no longer touch his wife without causing her harm, could no longer share the simple pleasures of marriage that had sustained him through years of difficult research. Love had become a memory rather than a living emotion. Mr. Freeze's criminal career began as a desperate attempt to fund continued research into Nora's condition. His knowledge of cryogenic technology, combined with his immunity to extreme cold, made him uniquely suited to crimes involving frozen assets. Literally speaking, banks found their security systems useless against someone who could freeze electronic locks and walk through walls of ice as easily as others moved through doorways. But Victor's crimes were never motivated by greed or power. Every heist was carefully calculated to generate the exact amount of funding needed for specific research equipment or rare materials. His targets were chosen not for their wealth, but for their connection to the medical establishment that had failed to save Nora. Each crime was a message written in ice, declaring that love could not be stopped by corporate greed or bureaucratic indifference. The file on Jonathan Crane reveals a different form of childhood trauma, one that shaped his adult obsession with fear itself. Growing up on his grandmother's farm outside Gotham, young Jonathan was subjected to psychological torment that would have broken most children completely. His great-grandmother Keeney believed that fear was the purest form of education, that children learned best when they were constantly terrified of making mistakes. Keeney's methods of discipline involved elaborate psychological torture designed to create lasting phobias. She would lock Jonathan in the church with crows and ravens, claiming that the birds could sense sin and would attack the wicked. She forced him to wear his dead grandfather's rotting clothes while she told him stories about how the dead never truly rest, how they hunger for the warmth of the living. Most disturbing of all, she convinced him that his own shadow was a separate entity that reported his every transgression to demonic forces. These experiences didn't break Jonathan's spirit. Instead, they forged it into something cold and analytical. He learned to observe his own terror with scientific detachment, studying the physical and psychological responses that fear produced in his developing mind. By the time he reached adolescence, Jonathan had become immune to most forms of intimidation while developing an encyclopedic knowledge of what frightened others. His academic career at Gotham University was marked by brilliant research into the neurochemistry of fear responses. His doctoral dissertation proposed that fear was the fundamental human emotion, the evolutionary mechanism that had allowed the species to survive by avoiding danger. Other emotions, he argued, were merely variations on this basic theme. Love was fear of abandonment, anger was fear of powerlessness, joy was fear of loss, temporarily suspended. Jonathan's transformation into the Scarecrow began during his tenure as a psychology professor at the university. His research had progressed beyond theoretical work into practical applications, developing chemical compounds that could induce specific phobias in laboratory subjects. The university administration initially supported his work, viewing it as potentially valuable for treating anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress. The ethical boundaries began to blur when Jonathan started using his students as unwilling test subjects. He would introduce trace amounts of his fear toxins into the ventilation system during exams, then study how manufactured anxiety affected academic performance. Students reported nightmares about his classes, recurring dreams where they were trapped in endless examinations while shadowy figures judged their every answer. His most ambitious experiment involved creating a Scarecrow costume that embodied humanity's primal fear of death and judgment. The tattered clothes and burlap mask were designed using principles of psychological warfare, combining elements that triggered deep-seated survival instincts. When Jonathan wore the costume, while administering his fear toxins, the results exceeded his most optimistic projections. Subjects experienced terror so profound that it created lasting psychological damage. The university discovered his unauthorized human experimentation when several students suffered complete psychological breakdowns during final exams. Jonathan's fear toxins had created a new form of academic anxiety so severe that victims became catatonic when faced with any form of evaluation or judgment. Rather than face criminal charges, Jonathan embraced his Scarecrow identity and disappeared into Gotham's criminal underworld. But the Scarecrow's crimes transcended simple bank robbery or extortion. His true purpose was advancing his research into fear itself, using Gotham's population as an unlimited supply of test subjects. Each crime was carefully designed to study different aspects of terror, from individual phobias to mass hysteria. He documented every scream, every panicked reaction, every psychological breakdown with the meticulous attention to detail that had marked his academic career. The file on Bane represents perhaps the most tragic origin story in Arkham's archives, the tale of a child born into hell and forged into a weapon through decades of systematic brutality. Bane was born in the prison of Peñadura on the island nation of Santa Prisca, condemned to serve his father's life sentence from the moment he drew his first breath. The prison's harsh conditions killed most inmates within years, but somehow this child not only survived but thrived in an environment designed to break human spirits. His mother died when he was still young, leaving him completely alone in a world populated by murderers, political prisoners, and men who had abandoned all pretense of civilization. Survival required constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and the ability to project strength even when weakness threatened to overwhelm him. Bane learned to read by studying religious texts and philosophy books left behind by executed prisoners, educating himself while surrounded by illiteracy and despair. The prison's library became his sanctuary, the one place where violence was temporarily suspended in favor of intellectual pursuit. Bane consumed knowledge with desperate hunger, studying military strategy, psychology, languages, and literature. By adolescence, he could speak 6 languages fluently and had memorized entire volumes of tactical doctrine. His mind became as formidable as his increasingly muscular body, shaped by decades of physical labor and constant threat. The Venom experiments began when Bane was selected as a test subject for the prison's most classified research program. Santa Prisca's government was developing a super soldier serum that could create enhanced warriors capable of superhuman feats of strength and endurance. Bane's survival record in the prison made him an ideal candidate for testing the drug's effects on human physiology. Venom was a synthetic compound that dramatically increased muscle mass and physical strength while simultaneously enhancing cognitive function. The drug created a feedback loop where physical power and mental acuity reinforced each other, producing subjects who were simultaneously stronger and smarter than baseline humans. But the compound was also highly addictive, creating psychological and physical dependency that made withdrawal potentially fatal. Bane's transformation into a super soldier was successful beyond the researchers' expectations, but it came at a terrible cost. The regular venom injections became necessary for his survival, creating a dependency that could be exploited by anyone who controlled his drug supply. His enhanced strength and intelligence made him the most dangerous prisoner in Peñadura's history, but his addiction ensured that he remained a prisoner nonetheless. His escape from Santa Prisca was as much intellectual achievement as physical feat, requiring months of planning and the systematic elimination of dozens of obstacles. Bane had spent years studying the prison's layout, guard rotations, and security procedures, while simultaneously building a network of loyal followers among the other inmates. When he finally broke free, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent preparing for a single moment of freedom. The file marked with the symbol of the demon's head contains records that span centuries rather than decades, chronicling a different kind of transformation altogether. Ra's al Ghul represents not the sudden fracture of a human mind, but the gradual corruption of noble purpose stretched across multiple lifetimes. Born over 700 years ago as a physician in a nomadic tribe, the man who would become the demon's head began his extended existence with the purest of intentions. His original name has been lost to history, buried beneath layers of assumed identities and reinvented personas. What remains clear from the ancient records is that he was once a healer, someone who dedicated his life to preserving human existence rather than orchestrating its destruction. His transformation began with a discovery that would curse him with immortality while slowly eroding his humanity over centuries of witness to human folly. The Lazarus Pits were initially discovered by accident, natural phenomena that his tribe encountered during their wanderings across the desert. These mysterious pools possessed restorative properties that seemed almost miraculous, capable of healing mortal wounds and reversing the aging process. But the pits demanded a terrible price for their gifts, gradually corrupting the minds of those who used them while extending their lives far beyond natural limits. Ra's first used the Lazarus Pit to save his beloved wife, who had been mortally wounded during a tribal conflict. The resurrection was successful in preserving her life, but the woman who emerged from the mystical waters was fundamentally changed. The gentle compassion that had defined her personality was replaced by cold calculation, and her love for her husband became twisted into possessive obsession. This first glimpse of the pit's true nature should have warned Ra's away from further experimentation, but grief and desperation had already begun their work on his judgment. Over the following decades, Ra's used the Lazarus Pits to extend his own life and that of his closest followers, telling himself that their extended existence would allow them to accomplish greater good than normal human lifespans would permit. He witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of entire civilizations, always positioning himself as a guardian of human progress. But each resurrection in the Lazarus Pit stripped away more of his original compassion, replacing human empathy with cold pragmatism. The League of Assassins began as a charitable organization, a group of long-lived individuals who used their accumulated wisdom and resources to guide human civilization toward enlightenment. Ra's genuinely believed that his immortal perspective gave him unique insight into humanity's long-term needs, that his centuries of experience qualified him to make decisions that ordinary mortals could not comprehend. The early League built hospitals, funded schools, and protected innocent communities from bandits and warlords. But immortality proved to be a form of psychological torture that gradually transformed benevolent guidance into tyrannical control. Ra's watched generation after generation repeat the same mistakes, saw civilizations rise to greatness only to collapse through greed, corruption, and short-sighted thinking. His patience with human weakness eroded over centuries, replaced by contempt for a species that seemed incapable of learning from its own history. The League's methods became increasingly extreme as Ra's concluded that humanity could not be saved through education or example. Assassination replaced negotiation as their primary tool for social change. Subterfuge and manipulation took the place of open collaboration with human governments. The organization that had once built hospitals now targeted political leaders whose policies Ra's deemed harmful to long-term human survival. Ra's relationship with Batman represents the culmination of his centuries-long search for a worthy successor, someone who could carry on his mission without succumbing to the corruption that had claimed his own soul. In Batman, he sees the perfect combination of physical skill, intellectual brilliance, and moral conviction that could make an ideal heir to his empire. But he fails to understand that Batman's greatest strength lies precisely in his humanity, his refusal to compromise his principles, regardless of the consequences. The tragedy of Ra's al Ghul is that his immortality has made him wise enough to see humanity's problems clearly, but too corrupted to solve them effectively. His centuries of experience have shown him exactly what needs to be done to create a perfect world. But the Lazarus pits have stripped away his ability to accomplish these goals through peaceful means. He has become a prisoner of his own extended existence, trapped in a cycle of resurrection and moral decay that makes him incapable of achieving the very goals that originally motivated his transformation. Basil Karlo's file tells a different story of corruption, one rooted in vanity rather than nobility, in artistic ambition rather than scientific discovery. The man who would become Clayface was once Gotham's most celebrated actor, a performer whose talent for transformation made him the toast of the city's theatrical community. His ability to disappear completely into his roles was legendary, earning him critical acclaim and popular adoration that fed an ego already swollen with artistic pretension. Basil's career began in Gotham's legitimate theatre district, where his performances in classic dramas established him as one of the city's premier cultural figures. His portrayal of tragic heroes was particularly renowned, partly because his own personality contained the seeds of dramatic downfall that would later define his criminal career. He possessed the actor's typical combination of insecurity and narcissism, desperate for validation while maintaining a facade of artistic superiority. The transition from theatre to film should have represented the peak of Basil's career, an opportunity to preserve his performances for posterity while reaching audiences far beyond Gotham's theatre district. But the movie industry proved to be even more ruthless than live theatre, with younger actors constantly threatening established performers and studio executives treating artists like disposable commodities rather than creative partners. Basil's psychological decline began when he was passed over for a starring role in a remake of one of his most famous theatrical performances. The part went to a younger actor whose physical appearance better matched the studio's marketing needs, regardless of his inferior acting ability. For Basil, this rejection represented not just professional disappointment, but personal annihilation, proof that his artistic achievements meant nothing in an industry obsessed with youth and superficial beauty. His transformation into Clayface resulted from a desperate attempt to reclaim his fading career through experimental treatments that promised to restore his youthful appearance. The procedures involved exposing his cellular structure to various chemical compounds that could theoretically reverse the aging process while enhancing his natural ability to alter his facial features for different roles. What actually happened was a complete breakdown of his molecular structure, transforming him into a shape-shifting creature capable of assuming any physical form. The irony of Basil's transformation is that it granted him the ultimate acting ability while destroying his capacity to be human. As Clayface, he could become anyone, assume any identity, perform any role with perfect physical accuracy. But the process had eliminated his original personality, leaving only a hollow creature obsessed with performance and recognition. He had gained the power to become anyone while losing the ability to be himself. Clayface's criminal career reflected his theatrical background, with each crime designed as an elaborate performance rather than simple theft or violence. He would spend weeks researching his targets, studying their mannerisms and psychological profiles with the same dedication he had once applied to preparing for dramatic roles. His impersonations were so perfect that victims often didn't realize they had been replaced until it was too late to prevent whatever scheme Clayface was orchestrating. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Clayface's existence is his persistent belief that his criminal activities are actually sophisticated art projects, performances designed to showcase his unmatched ability to transform into other people. He sees Batman not as a nemesis to be defeated, but as an audience member whose appreciation he desperately craves. Each confrontation with the Dark Knight represents another opportunity to demonstrate his artistic superiority, to prove that he remains Gotham's greatest performer despite his physical transformation. The psychological evaluation included in his file reveals the complete breakdown of Basil Karlo's original personality, replaced by a fractured identity that exists only in relation to the roles he plays. Without a character to inhabit, Clayface becomes essentially nothing, a formless mass of clay without purpose or direction. His greatest fear is not death or imprisonment, but the possibility of being forgotten, of his performances going unwitnessed and unappreciated by an audience that has moved on to newer, more fashionable entertainments. Dr. Arkham pauses at a file marked with the Wayne family crest, its contents revealing connections that extend far beyond simple criminal pathology into the very foundations of Gotham's social structure. The transformation of Oswald Chesterfield Cobblepot into the Penguin represents more than individual madness. It exposes the systemic corruption that pervades every level of the city's hierarchy, from the criminal underworld to the most exclusive social circles. The Cobblepot family once stood among Gotham's founding dynasties, their shipping empire rivaling even the Wayne fortune during the city's industrial golden age. Oswald's great-grandfather built the family business from a single fishing boat into a maritime empire that controlled much of Gotham's harbor commerce. The Cobblepot name appeared on hospital wings, university buildings, and charitable foundations throughout the city, representing the kind of philanthropic nobility that defined Gotham's better angels. But the family's decline began long before. Oswald's birth, rooted in the same generational corruption that would eventually consume his own moral compass. His grandfather made Faustian bargains with Prohibition-era smugglers, allowing criminals to use Cobblepot ships in exchange for protection money that kept the legitimate business afloat during economic downturns. These compromises with criminal elements gradually transformed a respectable shipping company into a front for increasingly illegal enterprises. Oswald's father died when the boy was still young, leaving behind massive debts and a reputation tarnished by association with organized crime. His mother, Miranda Cobblepot, struggled to maintain the family's social standing while secretly liquidating assets to pay off creditors who had little patience for aristocratic pride. Young Oswald grew up watching his mother sell family heirlooms to buy groceries, attending society parties where other children whispered cruel jokes about his family's financial ruin. the physical deformities that would define Oswald's adult appearance were apparent from birth, creating additional barriers to social acceptance in a community obsessed with perfect appearances. His short stature, prominent nose, and distinctive waddle made him a target for constant ridicule from other children of Gotham's elite families. But rather than breaking his spirit, this persecution forged his character into something harder and more calculating than his tormentors could imagine. Oswald's transformation into the Penguin began during his teenage years, when he discovered that his physical appearance could be weaponized rather than hidden. He cultivated an elaborate Victorian persona, complete with formal wear and antique umbrellas that simultaneously mocked and challenged Gotham's social conventions. His affected mannerisms and exaggerated courtesy became forms of psychological warfare, forcing others to acknowledge his presence while making them uncomfortable about their own prejudices. His entry into organized crime was initially motivated by simple survival rather than ambition. The Cobblepot family's remaining assets were heavily mortgaged, and legitimate employment was impossible for someone with his reputation and appearance. But Oswald discovered that the criminal underworld operated according to different social rules, where intelligence and ruthlessness mattered more than breeding or physical beauty. His encyclopedic knowledge of Gotham's social structure made him invaluable to crime bosses who needed to infiltrate high society gatherings. The Penguin's criminal empire grew through careful manipulation of both legitimate business and illegal enterprises, creating a network that was simultaneously visible and hidden throughout Gotham's infrastructure. His nightclub, the Iceberg Lounge, served as the perfect front for money laundering and information brokerage, attracting wealthy customers who had no idea they were financing criminal operations with every overpriced drink they purchased. But Oswald's true genius lay in his understanding of Gotham's fundamental hypocrisy, the way respectable citizens depended on criminal services while maintaining their moral superiority through willful ignorance. The Penguin became the city's unofficial mediator between legal and illegal enterprises, arranging deals that allowed both sides to profit while maintaining plausible deniability. His umbrellas, modified with hidden weapons and surveillance equipment, became symbols of his unique position as Gotham's gentleman criminal. The file on Jervis Tetch reveals an entirely different form of social alienation, one rooted in literary obsession rather than financial ruin. The man who would become the Mad Hatter was once a respected neuroscientist at Gotham University, specializing in research into hypnosis and subliminal suggestion. His groundbreaking work on mind control techniques was initially funded by medical organizations hoping to develop new treatments for addiction and post-traumatic stress disorders. Jervis's fascination with Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland began in childhood, when the stories provided escape from a home environment marked by emotional neglect and academic pressure. His parents, both professors at the university, viewed their son as a reflection of their own intellectual achievements, rather than as an individual with his own needs and desires. Young Jervis found solace in Carroll's nonsensical world, where logic was optional and imagination could triumph over harsh reality. His doctoral research focused on the psychological mechanisms that made certain narratives particularly compelling to human consciousness, studying how stories could influence behavior and belief systems. Carroll's work became his primary case study, partly because of its enduring popularity across multiple generations and cultures. Jervis discovered that the Alice stories contained sophisticated psychological patterns that could be used to bypass rational thought and implant suggestions directly into the subconscious mind. The transformation from Dr. Tetch into the Mad Hatter began when his research attracted the attention of government agencies interested in developing enhanced interrogation techniques. The funding for his projects increased dramatically, but so did the pressure to produce practical applications for his theoretical work. Jervis found himself creating mind control devices that were used in ways he had never intended, psychological weapons that could strip away free will and replace it with programmed obedience. His first successful mind control device was disguised as an ordinary hat equipped with microcircuitry that could transmit hypnotic suggestions directly into the wearer's brain. The technology was based on his analysis of Carroll's narrative techniques, using rhythm and repetition to override conscious resistance to external control. The hats became his signature, both as a tribute to his literary inspiration and as practical tools for criminal manipulation. But the Mad Hatter's crimes were never motivated by simple greed or power hunger. Instead, they represented elaborate attempts to recreate the whimsical world of Wonderland in Gotham's harsh urban environment. His victims became unwilling participants in tea parties and croquet games that seemed delightfully absurd, until the participants realized they had no choice but to play along. The mind control hats transformed ordinary citizens into characters from Carroll's stories, forcing them to act out scenarios that satisfied Jervis's desperate need for companionship and control. The psychological evaluation in his file reveals the complete breakdown between fantasy and reality that defines the Mad Hatter's worldview. Jervis genuinely believes that he is helping his victims by freeing them from the burden of making their own decisions, by creating a world where confusion and chaos are celebrated rather than feared. His crimes represent a twisted form of gift-giving, attempts to share the literary escape that had sustained him through his own traumatic childhood. His obsession with finding the perfect Alice represents his deepest psychological need, the search for someone who could appreciate his wonderland without requiring mind control to participate willingly. But every woman he selects for this role ultimately disappoints him, either because they resist his advances or because they're controlled. Compliance lacks the genuine enthusiasm he desperately craves. The Mad Hatter remains trapped in a cycle of romantic fantasy and inevitable disappointment, using increasingly sophisticated technology to force others into a story that can never truly come to life. The recurring theme throughout these files is the corruption of legitimate expertise into criminal application, the way Gotham's most brilliant minds become its greatest threats when their talents are perverted by trauma, betrayal, or societal rejection. Each villain represents not just individual pathology, but systemic failure on the part of institutions that should have protected and nurtured exceptional abilities rather than driving them toward destructive ends. As Dr. Arkham closes these files and reaches for the next set of documents, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Gotham doesn't just attract criminals, it creates them through a toxic combination of social inequality, institutional corruption, and the kind of urban alienation that turns gifted individuals into enemies of the society that failed to value their contributions. The medical files, scattered across Dr. Arkham's desk, reveal a disturbing pattern that extends far beyond individual psychological breakdowns. Hidden within the case histories of Gotham's most notorious villains lies evidence of systematic experimentation, deliberate manipulation, and coordinated efforts to transform promising citizens into dangerous criminals. What appears to be random tragedy begins to reveal itself as something far more sinister when examined through the lens of interconnected conspiracy. Waylon Jones's transformation into Killer Croc represents one of the most heartbreaking examples of society's capacity for creating monsters through systematic rejection and abuse. Born with a rare genetic condition called epidermolytic hyperkeratosis, Waylon's skin gradually thickened and developed a reptilian texture that made normal social interaction increasingly impossible. His condition was manageable with proper medical care, but his family's poverty and Gotham's inadequate healthcare system ensured that he would receive no treatment beyond basic pain management. The cruelty began in elementary school, where children's natural fear of difference was amplified by teachers who lacked the training or empathy to integrate a visibly disabled student into their classrooms. Wayland was segregated from other students, during lunch periods excluded from physical activities and subjected to constant harassment that school administrators dismissed as harmless childhood teasing. His academic performance suffered as psychological trauma, compounded the cognitive challenges associated with his medical condition. By adolescence, Wayland's appearance had deteriorated to the point where public spaces became battlegrounds of stares, whispers, and outright hostility. His family, overwhelmed by medical bills and social stigma, gradually withdrew their emotional support, viewing their son as a burden rather than a child deserving love and protection. The isolation drove Wayland to seek refuge in Gotham's abandoned subway tunnels, where darkness provided shelter from a world that had rejected him completely. The transformation from Wayland Jones into Killer Croc was accelerated by his exposure to industrial chemicals dumped illegally in the sewer systems by various Gotham corporations. These toxic compounds interacted with his existing genetic condition, enhancing the reptilian characteristics while simultaneously affecting his brain chemistry. The cognitive changes were gradual but irreversible, slowly eroding his human empathy and replacing it with predatory instincts that matched his increasingly monstrous appearance. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Killer Croc's story is that his violent tendencies were learned rather than innate. The cannibalistic behavior that would define his criminal career began as a desperate survival mechanism in the sewers, where conventional food sources were unavailable and human remains occasionally washed down from the city above. What started as necessity gradually became preference, as his altered brain chemistry made normal human interaction increasingly difficult to process or desire. Garfield Lindsay's transformation into Firefly reveals another pattern of systematic failure, this time within Gotham's entertainment industry and its casual disregard for worker safety. Linz was once a respected special effects coordinator, specializing in pyrotechnics for Gotham's thriving film and theater scene. His expertise with fire and explosives made him one of the most sought-after technicians in the industry, capable of creating spectacular visual effects that enhanced countless productions. The psychological seeds of his transformation were planted during childhood when his house burned down in an electrical fire that killed his younger sister while he watched helplessly from the yard. Rather than developing a healthy fear of fire, young Garfield became obsessed with understanding its properties, studying combustion and flame dynamics with scientific precision. His colleagues initially viewed this obsession as professional dedication, not recognizing the deeper psychological compulsion that drove his expertise. The accident that created Firefly occurred during the filming of a war movie that required extensive use of flammable materials and explosive devices. Studio executives, facing budget constraints and tight production schedules, pressured Linz to use cheaper, more volatile chemicals that he had specifically warned against. When the inevitable explosion occurred, Garfield was caught in a blast. That should have killed him, but instead transformed him into something far more dangerous. The chemical fire that engulfed Linz left him with severe burns across most of his body, but also created an unusual physiological condition that made him immune to extreme heat, while simultaneously making him dependent on high temperatures for normal metabolic function. His skin developed a mottled, scorched appearance that reflected light in disturbing ways, while his psychological relationship with fire evolved from professional expertise into religious obsession. Firefly's criminal career represents the convergence of technical skill and psychological compulsion, creating a villain whose crimes are simultaneously artistic expressions and acts of revenge against a society that had failed to protect him. His elaborate arson schemes demonstrate sophisticated understanding of building construction, fire behavior, and human psychology, turning entire city blocks into canvases for his incendiary artwork. Each fire is carefully planned to maximize visual impact while minimizing casualties, revealing the remnants of professional ethics buried beneath layers of psychological damage. Julian Gregory Day's evolution into Calendar Man presents perhaps the most intellectually sophisticated form of criminal obsession documented in Arkham's files. A former history professor at Gotham University, Day's academic specialty was chronology and its psychological impact on human civilization. His research focused on the ways that calendar systems and seasonal cycles influenced mass behavior, political movements, and social change throughout recorded history. Day's descent into madness began with his discovery of patterns hidden within historical data that suggested certain dates possessed unusual significance for criminal activity and social upheaval. His academic papers documented statistical correlations between specific calendar dates and increased rates of violence, political assassinations, and mass psychological episodes. The university initially celebrated his work as groundbreaking research into the intersection of temporal psychology and social science. But Day's research gradually consumed his entire existence as he became convinced that time itself was conscious, that calendar systems represented humanity's attempt to impose artificial order on a chaotic universe that operated according to its own mysterious schedule. He began to see his role as an interpreter of temporal messages, someone chosen to help humanity understand the true significance of dates and seasons that most people experienced as arbitrary markers. The transformation into Calendar Man was triggered by his discovery of what he believed to be a grand pattern spanning centuries of human history, a cosmic calendar that predicted future events based on cyclical repetition of past tragedies. Day became convinced that he could prevent catastrophic events by committing smaller crimes on significant dates, essentially offering himself as a sacrifice to appease whatever temporal forces controlled human destiny. Calendar Man's crimes are always timed to coincide with specific dates that possess historical, cultural, or personal significance. His elaborate schemes require months of planning and demonstrate encyclopedic knowledge of historical events, astronomical phenomena, and cultural traditions from around the world. Each crime is designed to serve as a temporal bookmark, marking important dates with acts of violence that Day believes will prevent greater tragedies from occurring. The psychological evaluation in his file reveals the complete replacement of normal human temporal perception with an obsessive fixation on calendar systems and their supposed mystical properties. Day experiences time not as a linear progression, but as a spiral pattern where past events continuously influence present circumstances through mysterious chronological connections. His cell at Arkham is covered with calendars from different cultures and historical periods, creating a temporal map that only he can interpret. The convergence of these individual stories reveals a disturbing truth about Gotham's systematic production of supervillains through institutional neglect, corporate irresponsibility, and social rejection. Each transformation represents not just personal tragedy, but collective failure on the part of systems designed to protect and nurture human potential. The city's hospitals, schools, universities, and corporations have all contributed to creating the very threats that Batman spends his nights fighting. Dr. Hugo Strange's file contains perhaps the most chilling revelation of all, evidence that at least some of these transformations were not accidental, but deliberately orchestrated by individuals who understood exactly what they were creating. Strange's background as a psychiatrist and his obsession with Batman suggest that he may have been conducting unauthorized experiments on Gotham's population, using the city itself as a laboratory for studying the creation and manipulation of criminal psychology. The documents in Strange's file indicate that he had been monitoring several future villains during their vulnerable periods, observing their psychological deterioration without intervening to prevent their criminal transformations. His research notes contain detailed predictions about which individuals were most likely to develop criminal pathologies, along with suggestions for environmental factors that could accelerate or direct their psychological breakdown toward specific forms of villainy. This revelation transforms our understanding of Gotham's criminal landscape from a collection of random tragedies into something resembling a carefully orchestrated experiment in human corruption. The restricted archives in Arkham's deepest vault contain files that challenge everything we thought we knew about the relationship between heroism and villainy in Gotham City. Dr. Hugo Strange's comprehensive research reveals that the emergence of Batman didn't simply inspire criminal response. It fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the entire city, creating new forms of madness while simultaneously attracting existing pathologies like a magnet draws metal filings. Strange's obsession with Batman began long before the Dark Knight's first public appearance, rooted in his analysis of urban vigilante psychology and its potential impact on criminal behavior. As chief of psychiatry at Arkham, Strange had unique access to Gotham's criminal population and their psychological profiles. He recognized patterns in their pathologies that suggested the city was primed for the emergence of both extraordinary heroes and exceptional villains, two sides of the same psychological coin. His secret research project, codenamed Monster Men, represented an attempt to artificially create the kind of enhanced individuals that Gotham seemed to generate naturally. Using experimental hormones and psychological conditioning, Strange transformed ordinary criminals into hulking creatures with enhanced strength and reduced cognitive function. But these artificial monsters lacked the sophisticated psychological complexity that made Gotham's natural villains so dangerous and compelling. The failure of the Monster Men project led Strange to a disturbing conclusion about the nature of heroism and villainy in Gotham. The city's most dangerous criminals weren't created by chemical accidents or scientific experiments. They were forged by the same psychological pressures that had created Batman himself. Trauma, loss, and the desire for control over chaos were the common elements that separated heroes from villains, with the only difference being the direction their responses took. Strange's files contain detailed psychological profiles of dozens of individuals who possessed the potential for either heroic or villainous transformation, people balanced on the knife's edge between salvation and damnation. His research identified specific trigger events that could push these individuals in either direction, environmental factors that could be manipulated to produce desired outcomes. The implications of this knowledge were staggering, suggesting that heroes and villains could be manufactured through careful psychological manipulation. Arnold Wesker's file provides one of the clearest examples of Strange's theories in action. The man who would become the ventriloquist was originally a mild-mannered bookkeeper whose psychological fragility made him an ideal subject for experimental manipulation. Strange had been monitoring Wesker for months before his transformation, documenting the gradual erosion of his mental stability under workplace stress and social isolation. Wesker's dissociative identity disorder manifested through his relationship with Mr. Scarface, a ventriloquist dummy that appeared to possess independent consciousness and malevolent intelligence. But Strange's notes suggest that the dummy's personality was carefully crafted using subliminal programming techniques, psychological conditioning that implanted criminal impulses while providing Wesker with plausible deniability through dissociation. With T, ventriloquists' crimes were always planned and executed by Mr. Scarface, with Wesker serving as a reluctant accomplice who claimed to have no control over his wooden partner's violent demand. This psychological split allowed him to engage in criminal activity while maintaining his self-image as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Strange's research suggested that this dissociation could be artificially induced and directed, creating criminals who were simultaneously responsible and innocent. Victor Zsasz represents the most extreme example of psychological conditioning documented in Strange's files. The transformation from successful businessman to serial killer occurred after Zsasz lost his family fortune in a poker game with the Penguin, an event that Strange's notes suggest was carefully orchestrated rather than coincidental. The psychological pressure of sudden poverty and social humiliation created the perfect conditions for a complete personality breakdown. Zsasz's nihilistic philosophy, his belief that life itself was meaningless and that murder was actually a form of liberation, developed gradually through exposure to specific philosophical texts and psychological manipulation techniques. Strange's research notes contain detailed schedules for introducing different concepts into Zsasz's reading material, gradually building a worldview that would justify increasingly extreme violence. The tally marks that Zsasz carved into his own flesh represented more than simple record-keeping. They were manifestations of a sophisticated psychological programming that used physical pain to reinforce mental conditioning. Each scar represented not just a victim, but a step deeper into the psychological maze that Strange had constructed around his subject's consciousness. The ritual of carving became a form of meditation that strengthened Zsasz's commitment to his murderous philosophy. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Strange's research was his documentation of the relationship between Gotham's heroes and villains, the way their psychological profiles complemented and reinforced each other in an endless cycle of escalation. Batman's presence in the city didn't just inspire criminal response, it created a psychological environment where both heroism and villainy could flourish in increasingly extreme forms. The files reveal that many of Gotham's villains possessed psychological profiles remarkably similar to Batman's own trauma-driven psychology. The difference lay not in their fundamental nature, but in the specific ways their traumatic experiences had been processed and channeled. Where Batman had channeled his pain into a mission of justice and protection, his adversaries had allowed similar trauma to corrupt them into agents of chaos and destruction. Roman Sionis's transformation into Black Mask provides a perfect example of this psychological mirror effect. Born into wealth and privilege like Bruce Wayne, Roman's childhood was marked by emotional neglect and parental dysfunction that created psychological wounds remarkably similar to those that had shaped Batman's origin story. But where Bruce had Martha and Thomas Wayne's love to sustain him until their deaths, Roman grew up in a household where affection was conditional and approval had to be earned through performance. The Sionis family's obsession with appearances and social status created an environment where authentic emotion was discouraged in favor of carefully crafted public personas. Roman learned early that his true feelings were unwelcome, that survival required wearing masks, both literal and figurative, to hide his genuine reactions to the world around him. This psychological conditioning made him particularly vulnerable to the trauma that would complete his transformation into Black Mask. The fire that destroyed the Sionis family mansion and killed his parents should have been a tragic accident, but Strange's notes suggest it may have been deliberately orchestrated as part of a larger experiment in psychological manipulation. The specific timing and circumstances of the fire created maximum psychological impact, stripping away Roman's carefully constructed identity while leaving him alive to process the trauma in increasingly destructive ways. Black Mask's obsession with torture and psychological manipulation reflected his own childhood experiences of emotional abuse, but magnified and projected onto others as a form of revenge against a world that had failed to protect him. His criminal organization operated like a twisted family structure, with Roman serving as the patriarch who demanded absolute loyalty while dispensing arbitrary punishment for perceived failures. The masks that became his signature were more than simple disguises. They represented his fundamental belief that authentic human identity was impossible, that everyone was merely performing roles designed to hide their true nature. Black Mask's crimes involved forcing others to confront this philosophy through elaborate scenarios where victims had to choose between maintaining their moral principles and surviving his psychological games. Strange's research revealed that Black Mask's methods were remarkably similar to the psychological conditioning techniques used in his own experiments, suggesting either direct influence or parallel development of similar theoretical frameworks. The convergence of academic psychology and criminal methodology represented a disturbing validation of Strange's theories about the artificial creation of supervillains. As these files accumulate on Dr. Arkham's desk, the scope of the conspiracy becomes increasingly clear. Gotham's transformation into a city of heroes and villains wasn't the result of random chance or unfortunate circumstances. It was the product of deliberate manipulation by individuals who understood the psychological mechanisms that create exceptional human beings. The question that remains is whether Batman himself was part of this grand experiment, or if his emergence was the one variable that Strange and his colleagues hadn't anticipated. The implications extend far beyond individual criminal cases into fundamental questions about free will, moral responsibility, and the nature of heroism itself in a world where psychological manipulation can transform ordinary people into extraordinary monsters. The weight of accumulated evidence creates an oppressive atmosphere in Dr. Arkham's office as the true scope of Gotham's manufactured madness becomes undeniable. The files spread across his desk represent not just individual case studies, but pieces of a vast psychological experiment that has been conducted on the city's population for decades. Each villain's origin story, when examined in context with the others, reveals deliberate patterns of manipulation that transform Gotham from a mere urban environment into something resembling a laboratory for studying human corruption. Lonnie. Mashin's transformation into Anarchy represents one of the most sophisticated examples of ideological manipulation documented in these secret files. Unlike the trauma-driven pathologies that created most of Gotham's villains, Anarchy's criminal philosophy was carefully cultivated through exposure to specific political and philosophical texts during his formative adolescent years. The teenager, who would become one of Gotham's most dangerous anti-establishment terrorists, was systematically radicalized through a curriculum designed to exploit his natural intelligence and sense of social justice. Lonnie's background as a gifted student from a working-class family made him an ideal candidate for ideological conditioning. His academic excellence created expectations that his family's economic situation couldn't support, generating frustration with social inequalities that could be channeled into revolutionary fervor. The psychological profile in his file shows clear evidence of external manipulation, with reading materials and educational opportunities appearing in his life at precisely timed intervals designed to maximize their radicalizing impact. The philosophical framework that would define Anarchy's criminal career was built through careful exposure to anarchist theory, beginning with more moderate critiques of government authority and gradually escalating to extremist manifestos advocating violent revolution. Each text was introduced at a moment when Lonnie's personal experiences had primed him to receive its message, creating a psychological echo chamber that reinforced increasingly radical beliefs about the necessity of destroying existing social structures. His expertise with explosives and electronics wasn't developed through conventional education, but through access to specialized knowledge that appeared in his life through channels that the files suggest were deliberately orchestrated. Anonymous online mentors provided technical training, while ideological guides reinforced his philosophical commitment to anarchist principles. The convergence of technical capability and radical ideology created a teenage terrorist whose bombing campaigns demonstrated sophistication far beyond his years. Anarchy's signature symbol, the stylized A surrounded by a circle, became a rallying point for disaffected youth throughout Gotham who found his anti-authority message appealing. But the files reveal that many of these apparent followers were actually undercover operatives, individuals whose job was to amplify Anarchy's influence while ensuring that his revolutionary activities remained focused on targets that served larger, strategic purposes. The psychological manipulation extended to his personal relationships, with potential romantic interests and friendships being carefully managed to prevent emotional attachments that might moderate his extremist beliefs. Lonnie's isolation was maintained through subtle social engineering that made him dependent on his anarchist philosophy for both intellectual stimulation and emotional validation. Arthur Brown's descent into criminal obsession as the Clue Master reveals another variation on the theme of manipulated failure and redirected ambition. Brown's background as a failed game show contestant might seem trivial compared to the tragic origins of other villains, but the files suggest that his humiliation was carefully orchestrated to create specific psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for criminal purposes. Arthur's original appearance on a television quiz show was supposed to be his moment of triumph, an opportunity to demonstrate the encyclopedic knowledge that had made him a local trivia champion. His preparation for the show had consumed months of his life, representing the culmination of years spent accumulating factual information that he believed would finally bring him the recognition he deserved. The systematic destruction of this dream created psychological wounds that proved remarkably easy to manipulate. The game show that destroyed Arthur's confidence was revealed in the files to have been rigged from the beginning, with questions specifically designed to exploit gaps in his knowledge while creating the appearance of fair competition. The humiliation of losing on national television was compounded by evidence that other contestants had been given advance access to questions, making his failure inevitable rather than the result of insufficient preparation. But the most devastating revelation was that Arthur's girlfriend had been paid to attend the show's taping and react with visible disappointment to his failure, adding personal rejection to public humiliation in a combination designed to create maximum psychological impact. The orchestrated nature of his downfall transformed legitimate disappointment into obsessive paranoia about the fairness of all competitive systems. Clue Master's criminal career represented an attempt to prove his intellectual superiority through crimes that challenged law enforcement to solve increasingly complex puzzles. But unlike the Riddler's compulsive need to provide clues, Arthur's criminal methodology was driven by a desire to demonstrate that he could outthink any opponent given fair conditions. His elaborate schemes were designed to create level playing fields where pure intelligence could triumph over institutional advantages. The files reveal that Clue Master's equipment and resources were provided through criminal contacts that had been monitoring his psychological development since his game show humiliation. The technology that allowed him to execute sophisticated crimes was too advanced for someone of his limited technical background, suggesting external support from individuals with access to cutting-edge criminal tools. His obsession with proving his intellectual superiority to the Riddler represented more than simple professional rivalry. It was the product of careful psychological conditioning that positioned Edward Nygma as the symbol of everything Arthur felt he should have achieved. The files suggest that this rivalry was deliberately cultivated to ensure that both villains would remain focused on each other, rather than investigating the larger conspiracy that had created them. The pattern becomes inescapable as Dr. Arkham reviews file after file, each containing evidence of external manipulation and psychological conditioning that transformed ordinary citizens into extraordinary criminals. The timing of traumatic events, the availability of resources and knowledge, the strategic removal of stabilizing influences from victims' lives, all point to coordinated efforts by unknown individuals who possessed both the resources and expertise. to orchestrate such elaborate psychological experiments, but perhaps the most disturbing discovery is evidence that these manipulations extended beyond individual criminal creation into the systematic engineering of conflicts between heroes and villains. Batman's greatest adversaries weren't just products of Gotham's toxic environment. They were specifically designed to challenge different aspects of his psychological makeup, creating opponents who would force him to confront his own deepest fears and moral limitations. The Joker's random chaos challenged Batman's need for order and logic. Two-Face's binary morality forced him to confront the absolute nature of his own ethical system. The Riddler's intellectual games targeted his detective abilities while appealing to his competitive nature. Each major villain represented a dark mirror that reflected specific aspects of Batman's psychology while serving as a test of his moral and psychological resilience. The files suggest that even Batman's success in preventing crimes and capturing criminals might have been part of the larger experiment, with certain outcomes being allowed or even facilitated to study the psychological impact of victory and defeat on both hero and villain. The cyclical nature of criminal escape and recapture that defined Gotham's justice system appears less like systemic failure and more like deliberate design when viewed through this lens. The most chilling possibility raised by these documents is that Batman himself might be unaware of his role in this vast psychological experiment, that his entire career as Gotham's protector could be the result of the same kind of manipulation that created his greatest enemies. The trauma that shaped Bruce Wayne's transformation into Batman occurred under circumstances that the files suggest may not have been as random as they appeared. As Dr. Arkham sits surrounded by evidence of systematic human experimentation conducted on a citywide scale, the true horror of Arkham Asylum becomes clear. The institution isn't just a hospital for the criminally insane, it's a data collection center for an ongoing study of human psychological limits, a place where the results of decades-long experiments in creating heroes and villains are observed, documented and analyzed by individuals whose identities remain hidden in shadows deeper than any cell in the asylum's maximum security wing. The final file in Dr. Arkham's collection bears no patient name, only a designation that chills him to his core: Project Mirror. This document, sealed with authorization codes that suggest involvement at the highest levels of government and corporate power, contains the ultimate truth about Gotham's transformation from ordinary city into a breeding ground for extraordinary individuals. The pages within reveal that every tragedy, every accident, every moment of transformation that created both heroes and villains was part of a decade-spanning experiment in human psychological manipulation. The project's origins trace back to the early days of the Cold War, when government agencies recognized that traditional warfare was evolving beyond conventional military tactics into psychological and ideological battlefields. The question that drove Project Mirror was simple but profound. Could human beings be systematically transformed into living weapons through carefully orchestrated trauma and conditioning? Gotham City was selected as the testing ground because its urban environment provided the perfect laboratory conditions for studying human behavior under extreme stress. The Wayne family's murder, the pivotal moment that created Batman, was not a random crime, but the carefully planned culmination of months of psychological profiling and strategic manipulation. Thomas and Martha Wayne had been identified as ideal subjects for creating the specific type of trauma that would forge their son into either a perfect hero or a complete psychological breakdown. The gunman in Crime Alley was not a desperate criminal, but a professional operative following a script designed to maximize psychological impact on 8-year-old Bruce Wayne. But the experiment's architects hadn't anticipated the specific direction that Bruce's transformation would take. They had expected either complete mental collapse or the emergence of a ruthless vigilante operating outside legal constraints. Instead, they created something unprecedented: a hero whose moral code was strong enough to maintain ethical boundaries while possessing the psychological drive necessary for extraordinary achievement. Batman's emergence as a force for justice, rather than revenge, represented both the project's greatest success and its most dangerous unintended consequence. The documents reveal that Ace Chemicals, the site of the Joker's transformation, was owned by a shell corporation controlled by Project Mira's architects. The chemical vats that created the Clown Prince of Crime were deliberately designed to produce psychological rather than physical transformation, using compounds that would strip away moral inhibitions while enhancing creative and intellectual capabilities. The Red Hood's fall into those chemicals was orchestrated with the same precision as Bruce Wayne's trauma, creating a perfect psychological opposite to Batman's rigid moral structure. Each subsequent villain was crafted to test different aspects of Batman's psychological makeup while providing data about human responses to various forms of conditioning and manipulation. Harvey Dent's transformation tested Batman's faith in institutional justice. The Riddler's emergence challenged his intellectual pride. Poison Ivy explored his relationship with nature and environmental responsibility. Every major criminal represented a carefully designed experiment in psychological warfare, with Batman serving as the primary test subject. The scarring revelation extends beyond individual manipulations into the systematic corruption of Gotham's institutions. Police corruption, political graft, judicial incompetence, and corporate malfeasance weren't symptoms of urban decay, but deliberately maintained conditions necessary for the experiment's continuation. The city's failure to address these problems created the environmental pressures that made ordinary citizens vulnerable to the psychological conditioning that transformed them into villains. Arkham Asylum itself was designed not as a treatment facility, but as an observation center where the experiment's results could be studied and refined. The asylum's notorious revolving door policy, its failure to cure or even meaningfully treat its patients, was intentional rather than incompetent. The architects needed their test subjects to remain active in Gotham's criminal ecosystem, providing ongoing data about long-term psychological conditioning effects and their interaction with Batman's heroic responses. Dr. Arkham discovers that his own family's connection to the asylum was part of the experiment from its inception. The Arkham family's history of mental illness wasn't coincidental, but the result of generations of psychological experimentation designed to create individuals who would be naturally suited to work within the asylum's environment. His great-grandfather's founding of the institution, his mother's madness, his own psychological resilience, all were products of careful genetic and environmental manipulation spanning multiple generations. The files reveal that many of Gotham's prominent families were similarly engineered over decades to produce individuals with specific psychological profiles suited to different roles within the experiment. The Waynes were bred for trauma resilience and moral absolutism. The Cobblepots were conditioned for social ambition and criminal flexibility. The Dents were shaped for legal brilliance and psychological instability. Each family line represented a different aspect of the human psychological spectrum being explored through controlled breeding and environmental manipulation. But perhaps the most devastating revelation is that the experiment's scope extends far beyond Gotham into other cities around the world, each serving as a testing ground for different aspects of human psychological manipulation. Metropolis was designed to study the effects of hope and optimism on human behavior, with Superman serving as the focal point for experiments in inspirational leadership. Central City explored the relationship between speed and moral decision-making through the Flash's activities. Each superhero and their corresponding rogues gallery represented different facets of a global experiment in human potential and corruption. The document identifies the true architects of Project Mira as a consortium of government agencies, multinational corporations, and academic institutions working together to develop techniques for large-scale population control. Their ultimate goal was not the creation of individual heroes or villains, but the development of methodologies for managing human behavior on a societal level. Gotham's heroes and villains were merely proof-of-concept demonstrations for technologies that could be applied to entire populations. The psychological conditioning techniques developed through the project have already been deployed in smaller scales around the world, creating local heroes and villains in dozens of cities while refining the methodologies for broader application. The rise of superhuman individuals globally represents not evolutionary advancement or coincidental scientific accidents, but the systematic rollout of psychological manipulation technologies tested and perfected in Gotham's urban laboratory. Dr. Arkham realizes that his discovery of these files was itself part of the experiment, designed to test how individuals within the system would respond to learning the truth about their manipulation. His psychological profile had been monitored for years, with his personality assessed for its suitability to serve as either a whistleblower or a collaborator once the truth was revealed. Even this moment of revelation serves the experiment's purposes, providing data about how knowledge of manipulation affects the manipulated. The moral implications are staggering. Every hero's triumph, every villain's defeat, every moment of apparent justice or tragedy in Gotham's recent history was orchestrated by individuals who view human beings as laboratory subjects rather than sentient creatures deserving dignity and autonomy. The suffering endured by countless victims, the psychological trauma inflicted on heroes and villains alike, the corruption of entire institutions, all serve the larger purpose of advancing techniques for psychological control that could reshape human civilization itself. But buried within the horror of this revelation lies a spark of hope. The experiment's architects had never anticipated that their subjects would develop genuine relationships, authentic emotions, and moral convictions that transcended their conditioning. Batman's refusal to kill, despite decades of psychological pressure designed to push him toward lethal violence, represents a fundamental failure of the manipulation techniques. The bonds between heroes, the unexpected redemptions of some villains, the persistence of hope and compassion despite systematic corruption, all suggest that human nature contains elements that resist even the most sophisticated attempts at control. The files conclude with a chilling assessment. Phase 1 of Project Mirror, the creation and testing of individual psychological manipulation techniques, has been completed successfully. Phase 2, the application of these techniques to larger populations, is already underway in cities around the world. Phase 3, the systematic psychological conditioning of entire nations, awaits only the refinement of technologies currently being tested in Gotham's ongoing urban laboratory. As Dr. Arkham closes the final file, he understands that his choice in this moment will determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of human psychological freedom. The whisper that began this journey through Gotham's darkest secrets has grown into a roar that threatens to shake the very foundations of everything he believed about heroism, villainy, and the nature of human moral choice in a world where free will itself has become the ultimate battlefield. The silence that follows Dr. Arkham's discovery of Project Mirror's true scope carries the weight of moral collapse on a scale that dwarfs even Gotham's most notorious crimes. The revelation that every hero's journey and every villain's fall was orchestrated by unseen manipulators transforms the entire narrative of good versus evil into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. Yet within this darkness, patterns emerge that suggest human resilience may be stronger than even the most sophisticated psychological conditioning. The evidence scattered across his desk tells two competing stories about human nature itself. On one hand, the success of Project Mirror demonstrates humanity's terrifying vulnerability to manipulation, the ease with which trauma and conditioning can reshape moral convictions and redirect noble impulses toward destructive ends. Every villain's origin story serves as proof that ordinary people can be transformed into monsters through carefully applied psychological pressure combined with environmental manipulation. But the other story, equally compelling, reveals the unexpected ways that human connections and authentic emotions have contaminated the experiment's controlled conditions. Batman's relationship with Alfred Pennyworth, for instance, was supposed to serve as a stabilizing influence that prevented complete psychological breakdown while maintaining his usefulness as a test subject. Instead, Alfred's genuine care and moral guidance created an emotional anchor that allowed Bruce Wayne to resist the conditioning designed to make him more ruthless and less principled. The files document numerous instances where authentic human relationships disrupted the experiment's predicted outcomes. Harvey Dent's love for Gilda provided psychological strength that delayed his transformation far longer than anticipated. The Joker's twisted affection for Harley Quinn, despite being rooted in manipulation, evolved into something resembling genuine emotional attachment that complicated his role as pure chaos agent. Even Victor Fries's love for Nora, though it drove his criminal activities, also provided moral boundaries that prevented him from becoming the completely amoral killer the experimenters had designed. These emotional complications forced Project Mirror's architects to constantly adjust their methodologies, creating increasingly elaborate scenarios to maintain control over their subjects' psychological development. The documents reveal that many of Gotham's most dramatic confrontations between heroes and villains were staged events, carefully orchestrated to generate specific emotional responses while maintaining the illusion of organic conflict. But the staging became progressively more difficult as the subjects developed psychological complexity that exceeded their original programming. Batman's detective skills, enhanced by years of investigation experience, began to uncover evidence of manipulation that threatened to expose the entire experiment. His relationships with other heroes provided alternative perspectives that challenged the isolation necessary for effective conditioning. Most dangerous of all, his moral evolution toward greater compassion and understanding made him increasingly resistant to the psychological triggers designed to control his behavior. The villains presented similar problems for their handlers. The Riddler's intellectual growth led him to create puzzles so sophisticated that they began to reveal patterns in Gotham's chaos that suggested external manipulation. Two-Face's binary moral system, while initially useful for generating predictable conflicts, eventually evolved into a framework for analyzing the ethical implications of his own actions. Even the Joker's apparent randomness concealed a deep understanding of human psychology that made him dangerous to anyone attempting to manipulate him. Project Mirror's response to these complications involved escalating the stakes and intensifying the psychological pressure on all subjects. The documents describe plans for increasingly traumatic events designed to reset the subject's psychological development and eliminate the emotional connections that were contaminating the experiment. Mass casualty events, terrorist attacks, and natural disasters were all considered as tools for maintaining experimental control. But the architects failed to anticipate how these escalated traumas would strengthen rather than weaken the bonds between heroes and their communities. Batman's connections to Commissioner Gordon, Oracle, Robin, and other allies created a support network that provided psychological resilience against even the most sophisticated manipulation attempts. The villains, paradoxically, found similar strength in their opposition to Batman, developing a form of purpose and identity that transcended their original conditioning. The moral awakening that threatens to destroy Project Mirror entirely comes from an unexpected source: the subjects themselves beginning to recognize their manipulation and choose to transcend it. The files document increasing instances of villains making moral choices that contradict their conditioning, heroes acting with greater wisdom and compassion than their programming should allow. and ordinary citizens of Gotham demonstrating courage and resilience that undermines the fundamental assumptions about human nature underlying the entire experiment. Dr. Arkham realizes that his own discovery of these files represents more than accidental revelation. It's evidence that the experiment's subjects have developed sufficient psychological sophistication to uncover and understand their own manipulation. The very fact that he can read these documents and comprehend their implications suggests that Project Mirror has inadvertently created individuals capable of transcending the limitations it sought to impose. The resolution lies not in exposing the conspiracy to external authorities, who may themselves be part of the manipulation, but in recognizing that awareness of conditioning is the first step toward psychological freedom. The heroes and villains of Gotham, by developing authentic relationships and genuine moral convictions despite their artificial origins, have already begun the process of liberation from their intended roles. The files suggest that similar awakenings are occurring in other cities around the world as subjects of parallel experiments begin to recognize patterns of manipulation in their own lives and relationships. The global network of heroes and villains that Project Mirror created to serve its purposes may instead become the foundation for resistance against the very forces that created them. But perhaps the most profound resolution comes from understanding that the moral convictions and emotional connections that contaminated the experiment represent something fundamental about human nature that cannot be permanently suppressed or redirected. Love, compassion, justice, and hope appear to be emergent properties of human consciousness that reassert themselves regardless of environmental manipulation or psychological conditioning. The tragedy of Project Mirror is not just that it corrupted individual lives and institutions, but that it was ultimately unnecessary. The human potential for both heroism and villainy exists naturally within every person, requiring neither artificial enhancement nor elaborate manipulation to manifest. The architects spent decades creating artificial conditions to generate extraordinary individuals, never understanding that the capacity for extraordinary moral choice is an inherent characteristic of human consciousness. Dr. Arkham closes the files with the understanding that knowledge of manipulation, while disturbing, also represents liberation from its effects. The heroes and villains of Gotham can now choose to embrace or transcend their conditioning, to continue playing their assigned roles, or to write new stories that reflect their authentic moral convictions rather than their programmed responses. The conspiracy that created them may have intended to demonstrate human psychological vulnerability, but instead it proved human resilience. Despite decades of systematic manipulation, trauma, and conditioning, the subjects retained enough moral agency to form genuine relationships, experience authentic emotions, and make ethical choices that contradicted their programming. In trying to prove that humans could be controlled, Project Mirror inadvertently demonstrated that the human spirit contains elements that resist even the most sophisticated attempts at domination. The whisper that began this journey through Gotham's secrets has revealed itself as the voice of human dignity, asserting itself against those who would treat people as experiments rather than individuals deserving respect and autonomy. The storm it generated will continue to grow as more subjects of the experiment awaken to their manipulation and choose to reclaim their psychological freedom. But the ultimate resolution lies in recognizing that even in a world where heroes and villains were artificially created, the moral choices they make moving forward are entirely their own. The capacity for redemption, for justice, for love, and for hope cannot be programmed or conditioned away. These qualities emerge from the deepest levels of human consciousness, representing the irreducible core of what makes us human, regardless of how we came to be who we are. The Gothic towers of Arkham Asylum stand silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, as Dr. Arkham contemplates the weight of knowledge that no human being should have to carry alone. The revelation of Project Mirror has transformed his understanding, not just of his patients, but of his own role within a system designed to study human suffering rather than alleviate it. The moral burden of this discovery creates a psychological pressure that threatens to crush anyone who attempts to bear it in isolation. The immediate question facing Dr. Arkham is whether to share this knowledge with his colleagues, his patients, or the outside world. Each option carries consequences that extend far beyond personal considerations into the realm of societal stability and individual psychological welfare. The heroes and villains under his care have spent years building identities around their origin stories, finding meaning and purpose in narratives that may have been artificially constructed but have become psychologically real through lived experience. Batman's entire moral framework is built upon the foundation of his parents' murder and his choice to channel that trauma into a mission of justice and protection. Learning that this foundational moment was orchestrated rather than random could potentially destroy the psychological structure that makes his heroic activities possible. The revelation might liberate him from manipulation, but it could equally, eliminate the driving force that makes him Gotham's protector. The villains face similar psychological dangers from learning the truth about their origins. The Joker's multiple-choice past might actually serve as protection against the revelation that all his possible histories were fabricated. But other villains who have built their identities around specific traumatic events might experience complete psychological collapse if they discovered their suffering was deliberately engineered rather than tragically coincidental. Dr. Arkham recognizes that the moral responsibility for making these decisions cannot rest with him alone. The paternalistic approach of protecting others from disturbing truths is itself a form of manipulation, denying individuals the autonomy to make informed choices about their own lives and relationships. Yet the immediate revelation of Project Mirror's scope could cause psychological damage that might take decades to repair, assuming recovery is even possible. The institutional implications are equally staggering. Arkham Asylum would need to be completely restructured if its true purpose, as an observation facility rather than treatment center, were acknowledged. The entire staff would require retraining in actual therapeutic techniques rather than data collection methodologies. More fundamentally, the asylum's relationship with its patients would need to transform from experimental observation to genuine healing, a change that would require admitting decades of ethical violations and institutional deception. Gotham's law enforcement and judicial systems present similar challenges. If the corruption and incompetence that enabled Project Mirror's success were addressed seriously, the entire infrastructure of criminal justice would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. The relationships between police, prosecutors, judges, and correctional institutions have been so thoroughly compromised by the experiment's requirements that reform might be impossible without complete replacement of existing personnel and procedures. The political ramifications extend beyond Gotham. National and international implications. Project Mirror's documents suggest involvement by government agencies and multinational corporations at the highest levels, indicating that exposure could destabilize political systems around the world. The revelation that democratic institutions have been systematically corrupted to enable psychological experimentation on civilian populations would likely trigger social upheavals that could be more destructive than the original conspiracy. But perhaps the most profound challenge lies in determining how to restore authentic moral agency to individuals who have been systematically manipulated throughout their adult lives. The process of psychological liberation from sophisticated conditioning requires careful guidance and extensive support, resources that may not be available given the scope of the problem. Helping heroes and villains develop new identities based on authentic choice rather than programmed response represents a therapeutic challenge that exceeds current understanding of human psychology. Dr. Arkham begins to develop a gradual approach that acknowledges the complexity of the situation while respecting the autonomy of those affected by the revelation. Rather than immediately exposing the full scope of Project Mirror, he decides to begin therapeutic conversations with individual patients that help them recognize patterns of manipulation in their own lives without overwhelming them with the broader conspiracy. The process starts with helping patients understand that awareness of conditioning is the first step toward freedom from its effects. By examining their own decision-making processes and emotional responses, individuals can begin to distinguish between authentic reactions and programmed behaviors. This approach respects their psychological autonomy while providing tools for resistance against ongoing manipulation attempts. The therapeutic work reveals unexpected resilience among both heroes and villains as they begin to examine their own conditioning. Many discover that their most meaningful relationships and moral convictions emerged despite rather than because of their programming, suggesting that authentic human nature had been asserting itself throughout their manipulated experiences. This recognition provides a foundation for building new identities based on genuine choice rather than artificial conditioning. Batman's response to learning about Project Mirror demonstrates the possibility of transcending rather than being destroyed by the revelation of manipulation. His detective training allows him to analyze the evidence objectively, while his moral convictions provide stability during the psychological adjustment process. Rather than abandoning his mission, he chooses to continue protecting Gotham while working to expose and dismantle the conspiracy that created the conditions requiring his protection. The villains show more varied responses to understanding their manipulation, with some embracing the opportunity for redemption while others choose to continue their criminal activities despite understanding their artificial origins. The key insight is that knowledge of conditioning doesn't automatically change behavior, but it does provide the psychological foundation for authentic moral choice moving forward. The broader community begins to heal as information about Project Mirror spreads gradually through Gotham's population. Citizens start to recognize patterns of manipulation in their own lives and relationships, developing resistance to psychological conditioning techniques while building stronger connections based on genuine mutual understanding. The city's culture slowly shifts from one based on fear and isolation toward greater cooperation and community resilience. The process of recovery proves to be generational rather than immediate, requiring sustained effort over decades to fully address the psychological damage inflicted by the experiment. Children growing up in post-revelation Gotham receive education about psychological manipulation techniques, developing mental immunity to conditioning attempts while learning to value authentic relationships and genuine moral choice. The work extends beyond therapy into practical reforms of institutions compromised by Project Mirror's influence. New oversight mechanisms are established to prevent future psychological experimentation, while existing systems are gradually purged of individuals who participated in or benefited from the conspiracy. The process is slow and sometimes painful, but it represents genuine progress toward restoring ethical governance and social trust. International cooperation emerges as other cities and nations recognize evidence of similar psychological experimentation within their own populations. The sharing of information and therapeutic techniques accelerates the recovery process while building global resistance to future manipulation attempts. The heroes and villains created by Project Mirror become advocates for psychological freedom and authentic moral agency. Dr. Arkham's role evolves from institutional psychiatrist to leader of a movement dedicated to healing the damage inflicted by systematic psychological manipulation. His unique position as both victim and witness of the conspiracy provides credibility and insight necessary for guiding others through the difficult process of psychological liberation. The work becomes not just therapeutic, but revolutionary, challenging fundamental assumptions about authority manipulation, and human moral agency. The aftermath of Project Mirror's exposure transforms Gotham from a city of manufactured heroes and villains into a community of individuals choosing their own paths despite their artificial origins. The conspiracy that sought to prove human psychological vulnerability instead demonstrates the resilience of authentic human nature and the possibility of transcending even the most sophisticated attempts at control. The whisper that began this journey has become a song of liberation that continues to spread wherever people choose authenticity over manipulation and genuine moral agency over programmed response. The first light of dawn filters through the ancient, stained glass windows of Arkham Asylum, casting prismatic patterns across the stone floors that have witnessed decades of human suffering and revelation. In the quiet moments before the day, staff arrives, the institution holds a different energy, one of contemplation rather than chaos, reflection rather than madness. The corridors that once echoed with screams and maniacal laughter now carry the softer sounds of genuine healing, conversations between caregivers and patients who are finally working together toward authentic recovery rather than perpetual containment. Dr. Arkham sits in his tower office, surrounded by files that tell stories no longer of manufactured villains and artificial heroes, but of human beings choosing their own paths despite the circumstances of their creation. The morning light illuminates documents that chronicle not just the darkness of Project Mirror, but the remarkable resilience of individuals who discovered their manipulation and chose to transcend it. These are no longer case studies of psychological conditioning, but testimonies to the indomitable nature of human moral agency. The transformation of Arkham Asylum itself reflects the broader healing taking place throughout Gotham, where once the institution served as a laboratory for observing the results of psychological experimentation. It has become a genuine center for therapeutic recovery and community support. The maximum security cells have been replaced with comfortable treatment spaces where patients work with therapists who view them as individuals worthy of dignity rather than subjects to be studied and contained. Batman continues his patrol of Gotham streets, but his mission has evolved beyond simply responding to crimes into actively building the social connections and community support systems that prevent the isolation and desperation that psychological manipulators exploit. His relationship with the city's citizens has deepened as people understand that their protector, like themselves, was shaped by forces beyond his control, but defined by the choices he made in response to that shaping. The former villains of Gotham have found varied paths forward in their journey toward authentic self-determination. Some, like Harvey Dent, have chosen to work within reformed legal systems to ensure that others receive the justice and support that they themselves were denied. Others, like Victor Fries, have redirected their specialized knowledge toward genuinely beneficial research, using their unique experiences to help others facing similar challenges. Even those who continue to operate outside conventional social boundaries have found ways to channel their abilities toward constructive rather than destructive ends. The Riddler's compulsive need to create puzzles now serves educational institutions that use his challenges to develop critical thinking skills in students. The Joker's understanding of human psychology has been redirected toward therapeutic applications, helping others recognize and resist manipulation attempts. The children of Gotham grow up in a fundamentally different environment than previous generations, educated about psychological manipulation techniques while being encouraged to develop authentic relationships and genuine moral convictions. Schools throughout the city teach not just traditional subjects but emotional intelligence, critical thinking, and resistance to authority figures who might seek to exploit their vulnerabilities for personal or political gain. The Gothic architecture of Arkham Asylum no longer appears menacing in the dawn light, but instead suggests the endurance and strength necessary to weather any storm. The gargoyles that once seemed to leer down at the city now appear to stand as guardians protecting those within from external threats. The building itself has become a symbol not of madness contained, but of humanity's capacity for healing and growth, even after experiencing profound trauma. The international implications of Gotham's transformation continue to ripple outward as other cities implement similar reforms to address their own histories of psychological manipulation. The techniques developed for helping conditioned individuals reclaim their authentic identities have been adapted for use in communities around the world where similar experiments were conducted. The heroes and villains created by Project Mirror have become advocates and teachers, sharing their experiences to help others recognize and overcome their own conditioning. The academic study of psychology has been revolutionized by the revelations emerging from Gotham's experience, with new ethical standards and oversight mechanisms ensuring that future research serves human welfare rather than control. Universities that once participated in Project Mirror have established new departments dedicated to studying psychological liberation and authentic moral development, learning from their subjects rather than merely observing them. The city's culture has gradually shifted from one based on fear and cynicism toward hope and community cooperation. Citizens who once viewed heroes and villains as fundamentally different from themselves now understand that extraordinary individuals emerge from the same human potential that exists within everyone. This recognition has fostered greater empathy and mutual support throughout Gotham's neighborhoods and social institutions. The relationships between former heroes and villains have evolved into complex friendships based on shared understanding of their unique experiences rather than simple opposition. Batman and the Joker occasionally work together on cases involving psychological manipulation, their different perspectives and skills complementing each other in ways that neither could achieve alone. These partnerships demonstrate that authentic moral choice can transcend even the most bitter historical conflicts. Dr. Arkham's own journey from unwitting participant in psychological experimentation to leader of a movement for therapeutic justice reflects the broader transformation occurring throughout Gotham's institutions. His work has expanded beyond individual patient care into systemic reform, ensuring that the next generation of mental health professionals understand their role as facilitators of human dignity rather than agents of social control. The evenings. Patrol routes that Batman travels through Gotham now pass through neighborhoods where citizens feel safe enough to walk freely after dark, where community centers provide support for individuals facing crisis, and where the social bonds that prevent isolation and exploitation have been strengthened through years of patient work. The city's transformation from a laboratory for manufacturing heroes and villains into a genuine community of mutual support represents one of the most profound social changes in modern history. The files that once documented the systematic creation of extraordinary individuals now chronicle their ongoing evolution into authentic human beings who have chosen to use their unique abilities in service of others rather than personal gratification or revenge. These stories continue to unfold as each individual discovers new aspects of their identity that transcend their original conditioning and programming. The legacy of Project Mirror serves as both a warning about the dangers of psychological manipulation and a testament to human resilience in the face of systematic abuse. The conspiracy that sought to prove human psychological vulnerability instead demonstrated the opposite, showing that authentic moral agency emerges from the deepest levels of human consciousness and cannot be permanently suppressed or redirected by external manipulation. As the sun rises fully over Gotham City, the asylum settles into the peaceful rhythm of a day dedicated to genuine healing and human connection. The ancient stones that have witnessed so much suffering now shelter individuals who are discovering their own capacity for growth, forgiveness, and authentic moral choice. The whisper that began this journey through the darkest corners of human psychology has become a symphony of voices speaking for the dignity and autonomy of every human being. The shadows that once concealed manipulation and control now provide comfortable spaces for reflection and contemplation. The corridors echo with conversations between people who have chosen to see each other as fellow travelers on the difficult path toward psychological freedom, rather than subjects to be studied or controlled. The institution that was built to contain madness has become a sanctuary for discovering the sanity that emerges when human beings are free to choose their own responses to whatever circumstances have shaped their lives. In the end, the greatest revelation is not the existence of Project Mirror or the scope of its psychological manipulation, but the discovery that human moral agency is stronger than any attempt to control or direct it. The heroes and villains of Gotham have become ordinary human beings choosing extraordinary responses to their circumstances, demonstrating that authentic heroism and genuine redemption are always possible, regardless of how we came to be who we are. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the hidden histories of Gotham's most complex individuals. If you enjoyed exploring these deeper truths about heroism, villainy, and the nature of human choice, please subscribe to continue discovering the secrets that lie beneath the surface of our favorite stories. Sleep well, knowing that whatever circumstances have shaped your life, the power to choose your response to those circumstances remains entirely your own.